Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever thought about how a leader really staring down an existential threat manages to just, well, flip decades of deeply held beliefs to make an alliance with someone you'd consider an adversary? That's the incredible tightrope Winston Churchill walked during World War II, as he painstakingly built and then tried to keep together what we now call the Grand Alliance.
It really is an audacious feat when you stop and think about it. World War II was, and this is no exaggeration, a fight for, well, civilization itself.
Right.
And yet the very alliance that crushed Nazism was its amazing, almost impossible partnership. You had capitalist democracies like the UK and the US, and then you had a communist state, the Soviet Union.
Just fundamentally different systems.
Completely. It demanded this level of raw pragmatism, where, for a time, the enemy of your enemy absolutely had to become your friend, even a temporary one.
And that's really our mission for this deep dive today. We want to explore how Churchill navigated that just astonishingly complex political landscape. We're going to look at that initial powerful unity of purpose, that single driving goal, defeat Nazism. And then we'll dig into the persistent, deep-seated differences that, well, despite the wartime unity, eventually came back to shape the post-war world.
They never really went away, did they?
No. So we'll look at the key moments, the agreements that built this bond, and then the powerful forces that, in the end, just tore it apart. So when we look back at Churchill, what were the earliest signs? I mean, his foresight about Hitler when so many others seemed, well, blind to it.
Oh, you can trace his clear-eyed view way back.
Yeah.
Back to the 1930s. He was one of the very, very few public figures who was vocally opposing that policy of appeasement.
Which was so dominant then.
Exactly. He just saw the Nazi regime for what it was right from the start. I mean, think about this.
Well,
August 1938, he warns Lloyd George, Britain faced a stark choice. War and dishonor, he said.
Oh.
And he predicted they'd choose dishonor first, then war, but under much worse conditions.
And he was right.
He was.
Where?
And his take on the Munich Agreement that September, even more blunt. He called it a real catastrophe. No mincing words there.
So this strong conviction, this pre-war understanding of the threat, how did that really shape his leadership when he finally became prime minister in May 1940?
Oh, it absolutely fueled it. Completely. When he took office, I mean, Britain was facing invasion, largely alone.
A desperate situation.
Truly desperate. And he laid out this singular, uncompromising vision. Just victory. His famous declaration, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Iconic.
It wasn't just rhetoric, was it? It was a rallying cry. It perfectly captured Britain's absolute focus. The total defeat of Hitler, full stop.
So for him, anyone who shared that goal
was acceptable, regardless of ideology, regardless of history.
Yeah.
Any ally was a potential ally. Now, he did have a vision for post-war Europe, restoring it as a viable, self-determining entity.
And the Commonwealth's role.
He saw that remaining as Britain's sort of global expression. But the key thing, he was willing to throw overboard any stereotypes, economic, social, and traditional for victory.
Which really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How can a leader maintain such a laser focus on one goal that it just overrides everything else, all those other significant differences?
It's the definition of wartime leadership, perhaps, that radical pragmatism.
It is incredible. And that famous quote, if Hitler invaded hell, I would make at least a favorable reference to the devil in the House of Commons.
Yes.
That really sums it up, doesn't it? His readiness for any alliances against Hitler. But how did that philosophy suddenly become, concrete action, especially given where Britain was at the time?
Well, that quote absolutely sets the scene for the next dramatic turn. The moment Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the Soviet Union June 20th at 1941, that was pivotal.
Right.
Now, most of Churchill's military advisors, people like Field Marshal Sir John Dill, General Alan Brooke, they predicted the Soviets would just collapse. Weeks, maybe 4 months, tops.
That was the expert opinion.
That was the prevailing military view. Yet, Churchill, in his radio address that very day, said, and I quote, "It was not unexpected for me." He even claimed he'd clearly and precisely warned Stalin about it.
Which is fascinating in itself. And that radio address, it wasn't just a prediction, was it? It was a major diplomatic statement.
Huge. He acknowledged his own history, his 25 years opposing communism, said he wouldn't retract a single word.
He owned his past beliefs.
They did. But then he immediately followed up by saying, all this pales before the spectacle which is now unfolding. His commitment was crystal clear. We are determined to destroy Hitler and all remnants of the Nazi regime. Nothing will deter us. Nothing.
Powerful words.
And then the crucial line for our discussion, any man or state which fights against Nazism will receive our help.
So what happened immediately after that? What was the global reaction?
It was incredibly fast. The formation of the Grand Alliance, UK, US, USSR. Just weeks later, July 12, 1941, you have the Anglo-Soviet agreement signed. Mutual aid and, critically, no separate peace treaty with Germany.
And they announced that quickly.
Announced over the BBC the very next day. Then in August, you get that secret meeting, Churchill and Roosevelt, the Atlantic Conference.
On the warships, right? HMS Prince of Wales and USS Augusta.
That's the one. They confirmed solidarity against the Axis, but also started outlining post-war goals. Sort of a Wilsonian vision, people call it.
Woodrow Wilson's ideal.
Exactly. Freedom, self-determination, cooperation, collective security. And importantly, the U.S. Navy started supporting British convoys practically right after that meeting.
So the political wheels were turning fast, but what about the practical side? The actual support for the Soviets fighting on that new Eastern Front, did that start quickly too?
Almost instantly. The first Arctic convoy sailed from Scapa Flow to Murmansk on August 21st, 1941. Think about that journey, treacherous seas, U-boats.
Hugely risky.
Hugely. And because those Arctic routes were so dangerous, so costly in terms of ships and lives, they needed another way.
An alternative route.
Right, so just days later, August 25th, British and Soviet forces launched Operation Countenance. They jointly entered Iran.
Iran? Why Iran?
To secure the Persian corridor. It was a land route for supplies. It also kept Iran's crucial oil fields out of Axis hands. Very strategic.
Makes sense.
And by late September 41, you have the Moscow Conference. The UK and US committed to sending monthly supplies. And we're talking everything: planes, tanks, weapons, vehicles, food, fuel, raw materials like aluminum, steel, even machine tools, field telephones. It was a massive logistical undertaking.
Truly an all-in effort, as you said. And then, of course, everything changes again. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor.
The event that brings the U.S. fully into the war. Germany then declares war on the U.S. a few days later.
And Churchill famously gets on a ship almost immediately. That risky trip across the Atlantic on HMS Duke of York, arriving just before Christmas.
Yes, arriving December 22nd.
What was the impact of his big speech to Congress?
Right.
The joint session on December 26th?
Oh, it was masterful, pure statesmanship. His goal was to really cement American public support, not just for winning the war, but for building this effective alliance, one that could actually secure a lasting peace afterwards.
He looked beyond the immediate fight.
He did. He powerfully declared that the United States, united as never before, unsheathed the sword in the name of freedom and threw away the scabbard. Powerful imagery. It really solidified this idea of a global unified front.
And that unity got formalized?
Yes, on May 26, 1942, the UK and USSR signed the 20-year Mutual Assistance Agreement in London. Key points: mutual aid against Germany, no separate peace, and importantly, a post-war commitment to act together against aggression to prevent it happening again.
It's really remarkable, isn't it, how critical that agreement was for defeating Hitler, especially when the Cold War was just around the corner.
It absolutely is. Despite everything that came later, its contribution to destroying Hitler's supposed 1,000-year Reich was huge.
It is remarkable, but here's where it gets, really fascinating for me. Even with that shared single goal beat Hitler, these allies had fundamentally, wildly different ideas about the post-war world order.
Deep divisions, yes.
So how on earth did Churchill manage that, smoothing over these huge contradictions, knowing they could basically blow the whole thing up at any moment? How did he keep it together until victory?
That was his constant tightrope walk. Agonizing, I imagine. For example, one of the biggest points of friction was Stalin's insistence on recognizing the Soviet western borders.
The ones from the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Exactly, the non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the one that secretly carved up Eastern Europe.
The irony there is just staggering.
It's devastating, isn't it? Because Germany invading Poland, based on that pact, was the direct reason Britain went to war in the first place.
Right, and you can't forget the Polish contribution either.
Absolutely not. Polish pilots in the Battle of Britain, the crucial Enigma code work, Polish soldiers fighting alongside the British, their contribution was immense.
So Churchill was in an impossible spot.
Completely. Diplomatically, he was trapped. He could not afford to agree to Stalin's demands about Poland's borders. But at the same time, he diplomatically did not give a categorical refusal.
Kick the can down the road.
Essentially, yes. He very cleverly suggested they discuss it later at a, let's say, more convenient time, post-war, basically.
But that strategic delay couldn't last forever, could it?
No. By the Yalta Conference, February 1945, the war is nearing its end in Europe, and Stalin is pressing the border issue with renewed persistence.
He saw his chance.
He did. Churchill, seeing how things were shifting, actually tried to persuade the U.S., Roosevelt, to support Allied forces pushing as far east in Europe as possible.
To limit Soviet influence?
That seems to be the idea. Create facts on the ground. But he couldn't convince Roosevelt or later Truman to go along with it.
So the war ends, the common enemy is gone. What happens then?
Well, just as you'd expect, those long simmering contradictions between the former allies burst into the open. They became glaringly obvious.
The unity evaporated.
Pretty much. The U.S., UK, USSR each started pursuing their own national interests, and that led to fundamental disagreements. Borders, yes, but also the political systems in liberated countries. Economic cooperation or lack thereof.
The seeds of the Cold War.
Exactly. It culminated in the sharp division of Europe. You had ideological clashes, huge arguments over things like the Marshall Plan in 47, the nuclear arms race, then the formation of rival military blocs NATO in 49, the Warsaw Pact in 55.
Splitting the world in two.
Two opposing camps. And this rift was then cemented by proxy conflicts, these local wars like Korea and Vietnam, where the superpowers backed different sides. The Cold War was well and truly underway, and it lasted until 1991.
It's such a stark lesson, isn't it? If you connect it to the bigger picture, the very things that brought them together against Hitler ultimately pushed them apart once he was defeated.
The common threat disappeared, and the fundamental differences reasserted themselves. It's a classic pattern, perhaps.
And through all that turmoil, Churchill's wartime government did lead Britain through the war successfully. His personal efforts in actually creating that anti-Hitler coalition were, well, you have to say decisive.
Absolutely crucial.
His personal mission against Hitler was done. It's interesting, of course, he lost the election right before the Potsdam Conference in mid-1945. Had to go back to London.
Yes, Clement Attlee went instead.
But he did return as prime minister later, 1951 to 55, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 53. He definitely holds an honored, undeniable place in British history.
Without question.
So when we look back at this whole deep dive, what does it all mean for us today? I mean, Churchill's leadership then, it was this incredible, precarious balancing act, wasn't it?
It really was.
Uniting these disparate, even hostile powers for one huge task, even though you knew their long-term interests were completely different, it really is a testament to, well, strategic pragmatism when you're facing an overwhelming threat.
It is a masterclass in focusing on the essential, perhaps. And it does leave us with an important question to think about, doesn't it?
What's that?
Well, where in modern conflicts, or maybe even global challenges like climate change or pandemics, do we see echoes of this Grand Alliance dynamic? Situations where you have short-term unity, maybe uneasy unity, coexisting with really deep, long-term ideological or geopolitical divides.
That's interesting.
And what lessons can we actually draw from the Grand Alliance's ultimate, perhaps inevitable, dissolution? It makes you think.